Yo, what's good, everybody? It's your boy King Ty Next here, back with another video, and we are going to be doing What If Deku was, well, Aries' brother. Before I even really start the video, I would like to thank Neptune for helping me, coming up with the quick to give a Zuko in this What If, because that was honestly something I was a bit stumped with at first, but now that that's out of the way, let's start the video. So Zuko, he would actually be born to a different pair of parents in this version of events. Aries' parents to be more specific. He would honestly have a relatively happy childhood until he was around the age of 4. You see, his parents actually buy him a puppy for his 4th birthday, and he would immediately begin to play with the dog. He would pet them at one point, just grooming the dog as you would usually do with these sort of pets. But he would notice something off about this new puppy of his. For some reason, his puppy was growing rapidly. Before he knew it, the puppy had ended up becoming a fully grown adult dog. His parents would have witnessed this whole thing as well, and they would pull the dog away from Izuku. Izuku's mother would contact his grandfather, the current head of the Yakuza, in order to connect her with a quirk doctor immediately. Izuku, she believed, had just awakened a quirk, and it seemed to be a rather powerful one at that. She was wary of this quirk to an extent. In this situation, well, there were no casualties, so there wasn't really much of a reason for her to have much hatred for her child, but she was still, of course, wary. She feared the consequences of letting that quirk run unchecked. Izuku would be forced to wear gloves for a while until the quirk doctor came to inspect the boy. It would have only taken a day for Izuku to be examined for a quirk, and a couple of tests would be ran by the quirk doctor until he discovered that Izuku's quirk seemed to have some relation to, well, aging organisms, at least on a very basic level of description. The limit to Izuku's quirk was still unknown at this point. They recommended that Izuku continue to wear gloves around people, and that he could experiment on insects and even small animals like rodents, so that people didn't really seem to care about. That would be precisely what Izuku did to gain an understanding for his quirk over the years. He'd have a close relationship with his grandfather as well. He would do his best to help Izuku with grasping his quirk throughout the years. He couldn't really help much since his quirk worked rather differently from Izuku's own, but he could at least supply the boy with materials to test his quirk on. By materials, I mean, well, the precious small organisms. Sometimes Izuku would be given a squirrel or a rat, and he would try to age them up to the point where they were basically a corpse. At other points, Izuku, he would be forced to hold the animals in his hands and not use his quirk whatsoever in order to gain more control over it. If it was a baby animal, for example, a baby bird that, well, just hatched, Izuku would do his best to simply age them up to mid-maturity, or like sort of like puberty in a sense for humans. Sort of like puberty for humans. Basically, Izuku would try to age them up to the point where they were midway to becoming an adult animal. As the years would go by, the more Izuku would comprehend his quirk, the more he experimented with these animals, and he would also try to gain more of an understanding for biology as well in this time. By the time Izuku was 10 years old, he would have also ended up meeting his baby sister, Eri. As soon as he saw her bright eyes, he would vow to be the best big brother possible and protect her from harm's way. With her birth, Izuku would also put more time into learning new aspects of his quirk, also into properties like only aging up certain parts of a person or maybe just aspects of a person. For example, if they had a wound, he could just force their body to speed up recovery. They would have scars, yes, but it was better than, well, bleeding out or anything. Azuku would also find that he could simply age up certain body parts rather than the whole body. In all honesty, that was how he discovered how to speed up recovery as well. Start off with the aging process of the arm, and the arm alone would just with the arm alone it would just grow to become that of a corpse if he aged it up to a certain point. Or it could just be a couple years older than the rest of the body, maybe even go on to grow smaller. Well, alright, so basically what I mean in this sense is that, like, after a couple of years of not using a certain body part, it will continue to grow weaker. That's basically what I mean by it becomes smaller. You can have a bunch of muscle in one arm, but if you never trained one arm specifically or one body part, or like you just leave that one body part to rest for a couple of years, and that body part is going to get weaker compared to the rest of the body. That was basically what happened whenever Izuku aged up a certain part of another person's body. Just that one specific part. And it would of course be a very good amount of years for this to happen as well. He would age up an arm of another person, and that person's arm, it would become more fragile than the rest of their body. Now when it came on to like the whole aging process of the smaller parts of another person's body, that's something Izuku would try to work on as well over the years. After he discovered he could age up a person's arm, he figured that it may be of his best interest to try and go smaller. That's how he ended up discovering that he could heal wounds as well. He would continue to grow smaller and smaller in terms of the way that he used his quirk as well over the years. By the time he was 14 years old, when his little sister actually first awakened her quirk, he would actually be there to stop it. In a sense, it would be a pretty horrific way of awakening her quirk. This would, of course, be her simply hugging their father. All of a sudden, he would begin to look younger and shrink as well. It wouldn't take a rocket scientist to realize just what was happening here. Azuka would rush in and he would use his own quirk to negate the effects of his sister's quirk. Their father, they managed to actually stop aging down, but he ended up being reduced to the appearance of a teenager. Azuku would sigh in relief, knowing that it could have been even worse if he didn't step in as soon as he did. Their mother, they would actually be horrified and begin to act irrational, fearing her daughter's quirk and the consequences of what would have happened if their son, Azuku, wasn't there to negate his little sister's quirk. Izuku could already tell by the look on his mother's face that she wasn't thinking properly. She was going to come up with a crazy idea, such as possibly getting rid of her only daughter that had just awakened her quirk, all because of a bad experience when first using it. He couldn't let that happen. As a matter of fact, he would not let that happen. So Izuku would request that his mother get some gloves for Eri while he aged back up their father. His mother would oblige, and Eri would put on the gloves with very little hesitance. She was afraid of her own quirk as well, but Izuku would smile at his baby sister. He would mention how he had it all under control, and that she had nothing to be afraid of. Izuku wanted to be a hero, but realized early on that his living situation wouldn't really work. He was the grandson of a Yakuza leader, for crying out loud. He was also going to, well, help Izuku train his quirk in the first place. So, or to become a hero meant that he would also have to put down his grandfather's legacy, and that would basically be spitting in the face of the person that helped him throughout his youth. Izuku didn't want to do such a thing to his grandfather, so instead Izuku would put more time into trying to become a Yakuza member instead. His grandfather had also taught him a couple of things about heroes. His grandfather showed him that not all heroes were goody two-shoes. You see, some of them were corrupt at times, but that was only some of them. Other heroes, yeah, they were good people, but just because a person was a hero did not necessarily mean that they were a good person. That's basically what his grandfather was trying to instill into the young Izuku's mind. And with the Yakuza as well, they were actually given a pretty bad rep. His grandfather gave people a place of belonging. Some were shunned for their quirks or their pasts, but his grandfather, he did not care about any of that. He only ever cared about loyalty. If you were loyal to him, well, that was all that ever really seemed to matter. Izuku respected that ideology. He remembered how his mother was about to try and get rid of Eri as well, just because of how her quirk managed to work and the way that it awakened as well. There were probably a whole bunch of people like his little sister out there in the world, just looking for a place of belonging, all because of the fact that they did not have the best experiences growing up, especially when it came on to their quirks. Or maybe just their facial appearances or appearance in general. Some people, they looked more monstrous than other people. Some people were shunned for that, and Izuku understood that he needed to help these people. Although he wasn't going to necessarily be a hero, he still wanted to help people regardless. He wanted to give these people a place of belonging, and this would be precisely why he ended up joining the Yakuza as well. Well, besides wanting to also help his grandfather. His grandfather did inform Izuku the fact that he would not be giving Izuku any special treatment though. Just because he was his biological grandson did not necessarily mean that things were going to be easy for him while being part of the Yakuza. He also raised a boy by the name of Chisaki who bared a rather powerful quirk. He called it Overhaul, and it had similarities to Izuku's quirk. Well, at least with how they messed with a person's biology. Although, when it came onto Izuku's quirk and how it functioned, it was more based on accelerating someone's biology. Chisaki, on the other hand, it was more so just altering and fusing different properties of a person's genes or biology in general. Chisaki was essentially going to be Izuku's mentor while he was in the Yakuza. Chisaki would have also been one of the people that, well, the Yakuza leader managed to actually raise as well. So telling him that he wasn't going to be given any special treatment was, well, also shown in Chisaki because of the fact that he also had to grow and develop to reach the status that he was in the Yakuza family at this point as well. Izuku would have no issues whatsoever with his predicament, having to actually strive to grow stronger, become higher in the Yakuza hierarchy. He had no issues with that whatsoever. What he did have issues though with was, well, Chisaki's ideology. He seemed to have this weird fascination with quirks for some reason. He called them diseases for some odd reason, believing that they were going to kill off humanity in the next couple of generations because they were getting too powerful or whatever. He didn't really get it, but he figured that it would be better to not even really ask the guy. not even really try and figure out what was this whole deal with quakes. Instead, Izuku would focus more of his attention on, well, just learning from Chisaki with how he used his quake. Izuku would do a couple petty crimes as well while under Chisaki's wing. He'd have a couple of run-ins with the police and some low-level heroes during this time as well, but Izuku, he would carry some tree seeds with him as a way to deal with these, well, heroes and, well, police officers. There were a couple of times where arranging the trees to act as barriers weren't enough though. Izuku would be forced to use his quirk to cripple some other heroes along the way by accelerating the development of their quirk genes to where their drawback, it just became too much for them to actually mitigate. That was for the newer and weaker heroes though. He basically made the quirks too powerful for the heroes' bodies, and the drawbacks to their quirks were too much to handle at that point as well. It also didn't really work for heroes with mutation quirks. You see, some of them, they literally only had physical based quirks. People like Miracle, or like what was his name? Gang Orca, you could say, mutation quirk users. His manipulation of the quirk gene, it would not necessarily work on them. Instead, he would have to be a bit more creative, and he would focus his attention on accelerating the aging process of some of their bones to where they would just become too brittle to use effectively in battle or to even move at all. Some could still be heroes using assistance from, well, specific gadgets to make up for the loss of certain parts of their body, but it was often irreversible damage Izuku did to these heroes. And even healing quirks couldn't really help the heroes, since Izuku's quirk didn't straight up harm the heroes. It dealt with the consequences of growing old, so yes, they could heal their bones, but they would still be the bones of a 90-year-old rather than someone in their youth. Sure, you could use some what was the name of it? Hero safety equipment or something along those lines. But in the end, they still had to deal with the fact that they would never be at 100% ever again. And that was terrifying in some of the heroes' minds. The fact that their literal livelihood could be taken away from them in just an instance, or well, a run-in with this one kid. The more encounters Izuku had, the more refined he became with his quirk as well. More heroes were being put into early retirement by Izuku, and some cities looked like forests after Izuku dealt with some of the heroes. Izuku continued to grow more infamous among the heroes and civilians alike. No one really knew what Izuku looked like though, since he often wore a mask and a hoodie covering most of his features. The public ended up making a name for Izuku during this time as well. They would call him Kronos for his control over the aging process of organic life. It seemed to be a time-based quirk it's basically seemingly a time-based quirk, and people weren't necessarily sure if Izuku could only manipulate the aging process of organic life, or he could extend it to inanimate objects as well. It's just that he chose not to, for whatever reason, and that's exactly why people called him Kronos, for his control over the aspects of time. With the Yakuza, Izuku would also begin to rise in the ranks, and he would rise in the ranks fast. As a matter of fact, it would be too fast in Chisaki's opinion. It made him envious as a boy. He was meant to become the leader of the Yakuza. Not Izuku. He was contemplating whether he should just kill Izuku and claim it to be the act of a hero or not one day. He was hesitant of doing that though, considering his relationship with a man that raised Chisaki. He didn't see much benefit overall of, well, just simply killing Izuku, but he was still jealous of the boy's success. He never really went through with killing the boy, at least not yet. He just didn't see much of a benefit yet. But that would all change one day when Chisaki ended up finding out a little bit more information about Izuku. This, of course, being in the form of his little sister, Eri, and just how her quirks seemed to operate. In layman's terms, it worked opposite to Izuku, in the sense that she could reverse the time that, well, okay, let me rephrase that. Basically, when it came on to Eri's quirk, she could reverse the aging process of a person. Izuku could speed up the aging process of a person, and with the way that Izuku had used his quirk before, Chisaki could only imagine just how crazy powerful this little girl's quirk could be if put into the right hands. He could technically create a whole new era for the Yakuza with the potential of controlling quirks in general. He could maybe create bullets that could permanently wipe away a person's quirk gene using the blood from Ares. Yeah, just using the blood from Ares. There would also maybe be a cure for the erasure of your quirk using Izuku's blood, maybe, but he could charge people a large price for both, since quirks in today's society were practically priceless. Unfortunately, he needed to get past his father figure, and Izuku's parents as well, if he wanted to ever get a hold of Eri. He suggested to their leader, but as Chisaki expected, he would be against the idea. Chisaki would sigh, not wanting to really do this, but he didn't really see much of another choice. He didn't really see much of another option in the matter, so he did what was for the greater good of the Yakuza, and now would be using his quirk against the man. He would end up putting his father figure in a coma, and he would take over the Shiosaikai from there. He would place both of Eri's parents in a coma during this time, well, just days after he had managed to put his father figure in a coma. He would attempt to actually take control of Eri's life from there. He would try to take custody of the little girl, but Izuku would actually be in defiance of this though. He would honestly just refuse to give up custody of his little sister, of his only sibling. He didn't trust Chisaki whatsoever. It was unusual for both of his parents and his grandfather to just fall into a coma one day. Well, let alone just days apart from each other. It was very unusual. He would find it strange, as a matter of fact. They all seemed rather healthy, but all of them, they just seemed to fall to an unknown illness one day. Well, at least days apart from each other. Literally only 5 days apart from each other, that they all fell into this strange coma that came from this strange unknown unnamed illness, or at least that was what the doctors seemed to tell them. Yeah, right. You sure Izuku would honestly believe that? Yeah, no. Izuku, he would immediately point fingers at Chisaki. He was literally the only person besides Izuku and Eri that seemingly had control over a person's biology to such a level. Or at least the people that Izuku knew could control a person's biology to such a level. He had the feeling that There was some malicious intent behind Chisaki's sudden desire to adopt the girl as well. Chisaki had also talked about wanting to control quirks at one point as well. The man had mentioned quirks being a disease and all that, and Azuku understood that with the way that he had used his quirk before, it meant that Eri could use a quirk similar to Azuku, just in the reverse. Her quirk was literally called Rewind, and that she could do everything that Azuku did, except in the opposite direction of time. Basically, everything that Azuku did, Eri could do the opposite of. She could negate Azuku's quirk and to go further down. Chisaki, he had a feeling that basically Azuku had a feeling that Chisaki would try to use Eri's quirk. He had a feeling that Chisaki would try to use Eri's quirk for his own malicious intents, and that was the whole reason why he wanted to adopt Eri in the first place. Azuku was having none of this though, and he would basically be called a fugitive or a traitor. Chisaki would order his men to apprehend Azuku, but Azuku, he would escape with Eri in his arms. Azuku would have to fend for himself and Eri from now on. There would honestly just be nights where they would have to sleep with growling stomachs, and they would also have to be sleeping in alleyways as well. Sometimes rain would hit them and Azuku would cover Eri's head with newspapers or cardboard boxes just so that she wouldn't get as wet as Azuku. Azuku didn't really care that much for his own safety. It was more so Eri's own that he really cared for. She was literally his only family at this point. So Azuku wanted to make sure that she was healthy, that she was safe from harm's way. He had made that promise from when she was born, and he planned on keeping to that promise to the very end. They would eventually find an abandoned building to live in for a while, but Azuku would also continue to rob some stores just to put some clothes on this little sister's back. That, and to make sure that she ate as well, he would rob some concession stores, or he would rob some gas stations, some food courts, all of those sort of places, just so that Eri and himself were capable of eating. He would also plant some trees as well, and use his quirk to speed up the growth process in hopes that they would actually bear some fruits, which sometimes they did. He would manage to grow fruit for himself and his little sister from time to time, but they wouldn't be able to stay in one location for very long. They would end up finding out the hard way, as a matter of fact, because one of the Yakuza, they managed to find the location one day, and Izuku, he would be forced to fend off against their pursuer, eventually being forced to use his quirk to cripple the older man. Both the leg bones became too brittle for him to even stand properly. Izuku would rush out to the building with Eri, and they would look for another place to stay for the night at. They understood that they would constantly have to be on the move until Chisaki was no longer empowered. Izuku would also be keeping up with the news during this time as well. He'd mainly be keeping up with the news to find out more about the Shiosaikai and all of these villain groups. But while reading through the news one day, he would end up finding out some new information. This information, would be regarding UA, interestingly enough. And it wasn't good news either, none of that. Instead, it would be about a raid on the USJ, intriguing Izuku actually. Izuku would read on in the report and find out that apparently this group of villains managed to raid the USJ, and during this raid they would have actually ended up killing a couple of the students, and in the process this would end up giving UA a bit of a bad rep. 2 of the students managed to die here after all. This was a first for UA. UA was always known as a pretty prestigious or like distinguished hero high school. It was seen as one of the very best within the world. It was considered a top hero school in Japan, but yet some rando villains managed to raid the USJ and kill a couple of the students in the process. UA would be under a very bad rep at this point, but they would try to cut their losses. Make they were trying to basically save face in light of recent events. UA was always known as a prestigious hero high school with top-notch security, and Izuku, he had also wanted to be part of this school when he was younger as well, before understanding his place in the world, before understanding that he could never technically be a hero, or else he would basically be disgracing his family, because eventually he would have to put down his grandfather and everything that he had built up over the years. Izuku did not want to ever do that to his grandfather, hence why he ended up joining the Yakuza as well, although now that seemed to be another fleeting dream, him being part of the Yakuza. Yeah, now he's literally running away from the Yakuza. Isn't life pretty ironic? Or like, I'm not even sure if ironic is something to be using here, but essentially Izuku always wanted to be part of UA. He would have been shocked to find out that at the USJ, some villains managed to raid it and they managed to even kill some of the kids there. Izuku would have been shocked, but he wouldn't let this deter him from continuing his flee from the Yakuza. He understood that the Yakuza, they were after him in Eri, and if he wanted to stay safe, he would need to continue running. Eventually, he would end up meeting the hero killer Stain in Hosu City one night, and he would have been in the middle of taking down a hero, and he would notice that one of the kids, or like, it's basically like this. The hero killer Stain, he would have been busy taking down one of the heroes until one of the students from UA decided to try his hand at stopping Stain, but his whole reason for wanting to stop Stain was something that he didn't like to hear. It sounded very unheroic. He wanted to get revenge for his older brother, and this immediately set Stain off. He wasn't here to save that one other hero from literally being killed by the hero killer Stain. This was unbecoming of a hero, and he would actually try to put down Ida as well. But Izuku, he would have came in right on time, because he would have witnessed that the hero killer Stain was about to kill Ida, and from the look at it, although he didn't necessarily know the kid, just looking at his face, he could tell that the kid was probably around his age. So Izuku, he would have used this moment in order to actually stop the hero killer Stain from killing him. He would have grabbed one of his seeds, and this would have actually been a bamboo tree seed, and he would have used it as his own sort of staff, you could say, by aging it up to the point where he could end up practically harming Stain with it. He would have extended it to the point where it was literally about to hit Stain. Stain would have dodged at the last second because of how fast it was moving, that he couldn't really just counterattack or anything, just dodge. And Stain would have been curious. He went at first saying that this was Kamui Woods, but then he realized that this was bamboo. Kamui Woods didn't have control over that sort of wood, and he would understand that this was the doing of, well, Kronos. He would look around, and Kronos would end up revealing themselves to Stain. Stain would be questioning why he was helping this kid, or at least seemingly helping this kid. Izuku would explain that, well, it was exactly that. It was a kid. This was a kid. The hero killer Stain was known for killing heroes, not kids. But Stain would try to explain that this was a kid that was trying to become a hero. This kid was unbecoming of a hero by trying to get revenge instead of trying to save another one of the heroes that the hero killer Stain was about to kill right before he came into the alleyway. Izuku would explain that the thing is, this is a kid training to become a hero. He's still learning to become a hero. He's not a pro hero just yet. He deserved a second chance at the very least. They could technically change. From the looks of it, this kid only seemed to be around like 15, 16 years old, meaning that he could continue to develop. And whatever way that he developed was, well, up to him for the most part. He could use this as a learning experience for how to handle villains moving forward. And for all he knew, that this kid could probably become one of the greats one day. Just because a person like All Might was around didn't necessarily mean that all heroes had to be perfect. For all they knew, All Might probably had dealt with these sort of issues when he was younger as well, but he used his experience to become a better hero overall. And if Stain was just going to kill off these guys young, then there wouldn't be any heroes left, technically. Stain would listen to Izuku's argument, and he would begrudgingly agree to let Ida be spared. He would be given this second chance, just once. So if he ever encountered Ida again and he tried to act very unheroic, then it was basically up to Stain whether he would kill him or not. Izuku would agree to this statement as well, understanding that this was probably going to be the best that he could really reach out to Stain, even being able to reach out to such a point where Stain would even draw his weapon or like hold back. I meant to say, from killing somebody. This was practically far more than Izuku expected from Stain. He thought that Stain was just going to ignore his argument and then just kill Ida right then and there, and then probably go after Izuku as well. But to hear that the hero killer was actually willing to listen to Izuku, I felt very, very relieving in Izuku's heart. Izuku would actually grab Ida and drag him out to the alleyway, putting him closer to, more public view, so somebody would eventually be able to find Ida and take him back to safety as well, because he understood that this guy Stain basically had him in a paralysis state, considering how he wasn't moving before or for the longest either. Izuku would have also hid this other reasoning for why he didn't want the boy to be killed, and this reasoning being, of course, that he just didn't want to see his little sister see another person so young die. She was literally only 6 years old at this point, so seeing another person die would be pretty traumatic towards her growth and development. Izuku didn't want to put that sort of issue onto his little sister at such a young age. They already had to go through so much already. So if he could avoid having her witness these horrific actions of humanity, then he would do his best to do so. Stain would go on to actually question what was the whole deal with this little one that was standing right next to Izuku, holding his hand, as a matter of fact. Eri at this point was wearing a mask and an oversized hoodie, and just like Izuku would simply state that Eri was a new recruit of his. The whole reason that she was holding his hand was because she was a bit nervous around the hero killer. That's about it. Stain would raise an eyebrow hearing this. Recruit? Izuku would see this as an opportunity of sorts. He would actually elaborate with his previous statement, mentioning how he was recruiting people for this new team that he was setting up. You see, he was no longer affiliated with the Yakuza ever since Chisaki came into power. He didn't seem to really like the sort of leadership that this guy had. He was just too power hungry. He was so power hungry, as a matter of fact, that he would be willing to do some pretty heinous actions just to fuel his own goals. Stain had a reason for killing heroes at the very least that Izuku could respect. He had the right intentions, which was why Izuku wanted to recruit Stain to be part of his team. Stain would question what exactly Izuku wanted with this group that he was setting up. Izuku would shrug, mentioning how he just wanted to create a place for everybody to feel like they belonged, since there were so many people out there that were judged for their pasts, their appearances, their quirks, all these things that they just could not control, and yet they were judged for it. Izuku found that to be incredibly unfair. The world was a cruel place, and these people needed a place to find themselves, to understand themselves, and to find more people like them. They didn't have to be alone within this world. So many things that they couldn't control, and yet they were judged for it. Of course, Izuku found this unfair. He wanted to help all these people, and Stain honestly had to respect that goal. Once he heard the goal, he honestly thought that Izuku was probably a true hero just from those words alone. Only a hero would be willing to say these sort of words, and from the way that Izuku said it, it sounded incredibly genuine as well. And that was because it was. Izuku genuinely wanted to help people, although his actions may not necessarily show it. But that's literally just how the media usually portrayed him as well. They didn't necessarily know him on a one-to-one basis or anything. They just knew him for his actions and his actions alone. Stain would agree to ally with Izuku. He wanted to know more about the little one though. He would actually promise to tell Stain more when they got away from the heroes, and Stain would understand this reasoning. The three would leave the scene right after Stain killed Native though, and of course Izuku would have covered Eri's eyes during the process. When the three managed to leave the area and find an abandoned building to talk, Izuku would use this moment to actually take off his mask and Eri's mask as well. This was basically his showing of trust towards Stain. He wanted to have trust be an incredibly important part of his team, and Stain would be shocked, to say the very least, shocked to find out just how young Izuku was, looking at his facial features, and to know he had a little sister by the looks of it as well. Stain was contemplating whether he wanted to work with a child or not, but then again, Izuku had proven himself to be a capable enough being in the past, even fighting heroes on a regular, and gaining a name for himself as well, both in the public eye and in the underworld. Stain would decide to stay with Kronos for now and see where this partnership was going to lead them. Izuku would help Stain in his dealings with the heroes, although less were being killed with Izuku's influence. Rather, more were actually being retired early. There were a couple who Stain managed to collect a lot of dirt on though, and once Izuku read all of this information on these heroes that Stain managed to compile, he wouldn't even hesitate to kill them by aging them up rapidly to the point where they would just they would literally just die a dried out corpse. Izuku would also add a couple knives and blades to his repertoire thanks to the influence of Stain over these next couple of months. The two would also manage to recruit a couple more people into their group along the way. Stain was a rather well-known name at this point, and so was Kronos. Knowing that there were people like these two basically teaming up, This would immediately put fear into many heroes and villains alike. No villain wanted to be on their bad side, so they would try to join their side instead. A few notable people would actually be individuals like a girl who could take on the appearance of others so long as she got some of their blood, a guy who could duplicate people with their strength, depending on how much he knew about their specific physical traits like height. And there was also a guy who looked like a lizard. Those were probably the most distinct members that recently joined Izuku's group. The last one was a serious hero killer fanboy for some reason, and he even wielded a bunch of blades in admiration or in honor of Stain's fighting style, although Stain just convinced him to swap them out for something more simple like a katana and a couple of combat knives to keep on his person. There were others who joined, but of course, like I've mentioned before, most of them were just a bunch of crude and not really all that noteworthy to even really mention. Himiko, when learning about Eri, would mention how she was adorable. She'd end up filling the role of a big sister to Eri along the way, although she kinda terrified the little girl at first with how intense that she was. They wouldn't be as big as the Shia Saikai yet, but they were getting there. They'd find an abandoned building to call their base of operations and home at one point. This would have been pretty far from the Shia Saikai as well, so Izuku was hoping that the influence wouldn't have spread to this area either. The group would even furnish this place up to where it would be suitable enough to really be living in. Izuku would build more connections as time went by, and these connections would prove to be especially important when the boogeyman of the underworld, All For One, ended up getting defeated by All Might in Camino Ward. All Might also ended up dying that day at Camino Ward, causing for them to be a power vacuum on, both sides. Villains, they began running rampant on the streets, with his team being no exception, Izuku's team. Izuku would also use his connections to find more spaces for his ever-expanding group. More villains were being bold now, but there were also more that wanted to join groups since they were too weak to fend off against, heroes on their own, and, rival villains at that as well. Being part of a group meant that although they had to share their loot, they would still get some loot in the end, rather than literally being on their own and having to face off against all these different villains who would be stealing their loot along the way, and they were just too weak to be able to do anything against them. They would also find out about the League of Villains during this time as well, or at least hear more about the League of Villains. You see, they were originally known for killing some of the students at the USJ, but now they were also known for raiding a forest that Class 1A and B of UA High School were training in, and capturing two of the students, Bakugo Katsuki and Tokiyama Fumakage. Some of the students also ended up dying to the villains there at the forest training like the mountain, or like the mountain lodge, whatever you want to call it. Basically, the properties of the pussycats, and of the wild pussycats. And essentially what ended up happening is that even now, UA was already pretty hot with the press. They were now basically being tortured by the press at this point. The press was literally chewing UA out for all of this bad behavior. all of these actions that were happening recently that discredited UA's history. Basically, UA's ratings were at an all-time low. They were literally being called probably one of the worst high schools at this point for heroes with how bad their security was, or at least how bad it was getting, essentially, with all of these captures, all of these deaths, and UA was trying to act as if nothing was wrong whatsoever. Some of the students even ended up dying to these villains this time around. And of course, these villains would have been people like Muscular and Moonfish. If you guys are questioning who ended up getting one for all in this version of events, it would have been Muriel, by the way. And because Muriel was in Class 3B, they would not have been there to help the students of, Class 1A and B during the whole issue with Muscular and Moonfish. These people who would have been especially strong. And then you also have the issue of Kota. He would have also died to Muscular during this time as well. You have Mustard, who would have used some, what was it again, like some sleeping gas on these different people within Class 1A and B. Sure, some of them ended up creating gas masks in order to mitigate the damage done by Mustard, but a lot of them, they would have ended up falling unconscious, and a lot of them would have ended up dying to either Moonfish or, Muscular. The forest was basically burned down as well, thanks to a person by the name of Dabi, and apparently they had connections to All For One. All For One, oddly enough, the League of Villains more specifically. They had become quite a prominent group at this point in time, so Izuku had some more competition on his hands. He had to watch out for the League of Villains. They were growing a bit too rapidly for Izuku's liking. Granted, he was also growing rapidly, but they weren't really known for it. All of these actions, all of these heinous actions like the League of Villains was. They were more so known for the people that they had within their group at this time, although literally the only people that were really known were himself and Stain. Others, they had to build up their street credibility. While Izuku was reading some of the news one day, just learning more about the League of Villains and how they were moving, Stain would have ended up actually walking into his office, and he would notice the newspaper that Izuku was reading. Stain would comment on how the League of Villains actually tried recruiting him at one point, but their supposed leader, Shigaraki, he found was literally nothing more than a man-child with no real goal besides destruction. Izuku literally had nothing to worry about when it came onto the League of Villains, which would slightly relieve Izuku, but then again, how was the League of Villains operating if they had such a guy in charge? There had to be somebody else who was really leading the show, or were they really just all about destruction and chaos? If so, then Izuku supposed that the only thing you really had to worry about when it came onto the League of Villains was just the amount of damage that they could create in that sense. Izuku would also find out from one of his sources that the League of Villains was teaming up with a Shiosaikai, apparently, which he figured that Chisaki had more of a role to play in than, Shigaraki himself, just going based off of what he heard from Stain. He figured that Chisaki was probably going to use these allied forces to come after him in Eri. After all, he did want to use Eri's Quake, or at least he figured that Chisaki for the longest wanted to use Eri's Quake for one reason or another. He'd prepare his group to actually raid the Shiosaikai first, though. The raid would end up suffering some casualties, though. But Izuku, he had enough manpower at this point to succeed in taking down the Shiosaikai. He would make sure to cripple the Shiosaikai when he was finished with them. Chisaki would end up being found by Izuku along the way. They would confront each other, and Chisaki, he would try to kill Izuku, but Izuku, he would have been too fast for Chisaki at this point. You see, Izuku, he had to build up his group from the ground up, and he would manage to gain a lot more combat experience than Chisaki ever did. His quirk wasn't an immediate one-hit KO like Chisaki's own either, so he had to learn to maneuver better in fights than simply relying on his quirk to handle everything. Izuku would grab Chisaki's head and quickly age up his mind to the point where his brain literally began to rot. He was brain dead when Izuku managed to finish him off as well. The war against the Shiosaikai would be over after that point. Izuku's group would take over and Izuku would gain a new empire. The League of Villains wouldn't have expected this at all. Izuku would offer the League a chance to join his new Shiosaikai as well as a place of belonging, but only Dabi would really accept the olive branch. Shigaraki didn't really want any of Izuku's pity though, and he would even call Dabi a traitor as well, but Dabi didn't really seem to care. He saw Izuku's group as a better way of furthering his own goals. He had quite a bit of ambition after all, this ambition being more so focused towards people like Endeavor though, and wanting to put an end to their life as heroes. They tried to, Shigaraki, he would end up trying to attack Izuku's group alongside the rest of the remaining League of Villain members, but they would be defeated rather easily at this point. Izuku, he would kill Shigaraki and the rest of the League during this time, since he couldn't trust these individuals. They seemed too unstable, too sporadic. He didn't like these sort of people. He cared about people he could trust, and these guys did not seem all that trustworthy whatsoever. He was trying to also deal with Izuku's group, but most of the time, they would be put in permanent retirement. Some of the villains would learn about just how Izuku's quirk operated, and that he had a sister as well who could do the reverse of her brother. They didn't want to take any chances at this point either. They were stronger villains, but even then, they didn't want to risk possibly losing their quirks, or literally having their quirks implode on them, just end up reacting negatively towards them as if these quirks weren't even theirs anymore. And so they would end up joining Izuku's group. They didn't want to take these sort of chances after all. And people from the Liberation Army would also hear about the new Shiosaikai, or as Izuku called this new group, Nirvana. Intriguing name, but it's like, yeah, I literally just came up with it on the spot. But you see, Reed Destro would end up getting worried about Nirvana. He found this group to be interesting. He wanted them to join his Liberation Army, seeing as how they seemed to have similar goals, but Izuku didn't want to work underneath the man. If anything, they could possibly arrange an alliance, but Reed Destro, he wasn't having any of that. He was not really interested in literally working with Izuku. He didn't want to necessarily see eye to eye with Izuku. He wanted Izuku to work underneath him, and that was final. He saw Izuku basically as beneath him, and the Liberation Army, they would send some of their soldiers to take down Nirvana. He saw this as a declaration of war right after he managed to pretty much defeat these guys rather easily. These guys were pretty pathetic overall, and Izuku's group had gone through enough to where they were incredibly strong individuals. But seeing the Liberation Army literally send in people to try and take them down was what basically set Izuku off. He saw this as a true declaration of war, and he would have had some of his most trusted members of Nirvana watch over Eri in one of their lesser-known bases until he came back from vanquishing the Liberation Army. The battle would be their toughest yet, but during this fight, something unprecedented would end up happening to the group. The tides of the war would have changed to be in Izuku's favor over time when he and other members of Nirvana began to fully awaken their quirks. Izuku would discover that his quirk could work on inanimate objects, which he would end up using to crumble some of the buildings, which would kill a large portion of the Liberation Army. We'd also find that, of course, when it came on to how he used this quirk. He realized that he could literally have the effects of his quirk spread from one person to another, like a disease of some sort. Stain would find himself able to control the blood circulation and other people's bodies after consuming some of their blood, and he would use it to take over some of the Liberation Army's bodies. They would be forced to use their quirks against their allies as a result, pushing their quirks to the absolute limit beyond what they could even handle, which would damage their bodies as a result as well. Toga, she would turn into one of the Liberation Army members, Getten, and even use his quirk against her opponent. Or, well, not her quirk, his quirk technically, against her opponents. Twice, after discovering he was the original with all of the pain he had felt from some of the grunts of the Liberation Army, would have no fear in cloning himself multiple times over like he used to when he was younger, before the whole incident that basically left him with the scar on his forehead. He would create his own army as well, an army of himself, and what made this especially terrifying as well was the fact that his clones all had the same quirk as him, meaning that they could all duplicate themselves and their allies practically an infinite amount of times. Although they would not have the same durability as the original users, they still had the same amount of strength as the users. Izuku would end up confronting Reed Destro after he was done dealing with a good amount of Reed Destro's army, and he would notice the man beginning to power up while explaining how his quirk worked. But he would actually stop the man mid-transformation. He would rapidly accelerate the potential of his quirk gene to the point where Reed Destro couldn't even handle the drawbacks anymore. The power was too intense for him to handle, and his body had not yet properly adjusted, and it would be too late for him to deactivate his quirk as well. The backlash from his quirk would be enough to completely wreck his body at this point, and the rest of the Liberation Army would crumble from there on. And Izuku, he would just be there to pick up the loose ends, pick up the twigs, the scavengers. Basically pick up the leftovers and rebuild from there. Izuku would have taken charge of the city from that day moving forward, and this empire of his, it would only continue to expand from there, with Eri growing up right beside him, learning how to use her quirk along the way until she had enough precision over it to be one of his acting officers. Heroes and villains alike would join this new empire of Izuku's, and he would develop a society where they didn't judge a person for the things that they could not necessarily control. They only judged you for your actions. And some people on the outside, they would simply call Izuku's empire that of a cult, but Izuku didn't really see it as that. He saw it as perfection, as true nirvana. And of course, over time, people would end up practically worshipping Izuku for his deeds over the years, as if he was a god. But Izuku never truly ended up seeing himself as that. He just saw himself as another man who managed to accomplish his dreams. But yeah, that's basically it, Titan Clan. It's your boy King Titan X signing out. And you guys already know the deal. If you like the video, maybe leave a like. And if you've been rocking my content for a little while, maybe hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and maybe share the video to some others who may be interested in this sort of content. I'll leave the link to Neptune's Wattpad in the description as well if you want to check out some of her stories, especially since that she did help me with figuring how to create the quirk in the first place as well. But yeah, that's literally all I got for right now. Titan Clan, it's your boy King Titan X out. Peace.